and welcome to the Being Human podcast, where we explore what it means to truly be human, physically, mentally, and spiritually. We upload an episode of this podcast every single week, so hit that subscribe button. You do not want to miss any of these episodes. The Being Human podcast is now brought to you by Grappler's Coffee. Caffeine is a performance-enhancing drug, both physically and mentally. You should be consuming at least some caffeine on a regular basis, and when you do, you want to consume it the right way. Grappler's Coffee is an outstanding coffee. You do not need to be a grappler to drink it. This is simply an outstanding coffee for everyone, whether you like to choke people or not. What you need to do is you need to head over to mrbassets.com and use the code WAG10 for 10% off your order and pick up a bar of Grappler's soap whilst you're there. On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with Jessica Alana. Jessica is a biomedical scientist. Her work largely centers around mold illness and chronic inflammatory response syndrome. She works a great deal with regenerative medicine, in particular peptides. I started off our conversation by speaking with Jessica about the peptides. Jessica told us everything we need to know about BPC 157, the thymosin peptides, thymosin beta 4 or TB500 as it's better known, thymosin alpha 1, the growth hormone releasing peptides and stimulating peptides such as ipamorelin, CJC, and we also talked about KPV. Jessica shared a great deal of knowledge on these peptides. I think we need more education around them, and Jessica certainly provided that in this conversation. We then moved over into mold illness. Mold illness is something which is a lot more prominent than people realise. Many people listening to this probably haven't heard about mold illness, but many people are suffering with it. Many people are suffering with it even though they're unaware that they are. We then finished off the conversation with Jessica sharing an incredibly moving and inspirational personal story. Loads of useful knowledge and actionable advice shared by Jessica in this episode. I do not doubt you'll find value in it. If you do, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Give this video a thumbs up, drop a comment below as well, share it around on social media. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, make sure to hit those 5 stars as well. Tell everybody about Being Human, get them watching, get them on the train. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for supporting Being Human. So to start off with, could you give us an outline, please, of who you are, Jessica, and what your background is and the work that you do?
Yeah, so I'm a biomedical scientist by degree and by training. And as soon as I came out of university, I started actually working in regenerative medicine. So there is a really cool hyperbaric oxygen clinic in Hyde Park, and that was my first kind of client-facing role. After this, I moved to Dubai and I became super fixated on mold illness and chronic inflammatory response syndrome. And now that's primarily what I do. I am comfortable with around 10 different modalities, like peptides, hyperbaric oxygen, ozone therapy, EBO2, PEMF, I know a lot about as well, photobiomodulation, transcranial photobiomodulation. So I know around 10 different modalities in depth. I'm always learning more, like low-dose naltrexone and all of that type of immunomodulating therapies are cropping up. But primarily now, I focus a lot on mold illness and chronic inflammatory response syndrome.
And a massive part of that is a focus on peptides, the use of peptides to treat mold illness. I'm not too familiar with the use of peptides in mold illness. I want us to go into that in a little bit, but I do have experience with peptides in a more general sense. Anybody that knows me knows that I'm a massive advocate for peptides. I think people should be better educated on them. There should be more use of them in different medical settings because I think they're extremely helpful. So if we could go into the peptide side of things first, if you could give us an overview on what peptides actually are, because obviously the term's thrown around a lot. What is a peptide?
Yeah, so I also love peptides. And actually, peptides are pretty simple. So they're just amino acids between 4 and 50 in chain length, and they're bonded together via a peptide bond. So people have a lot of misconceptions about peptides because you have to use a needle. And the moment a needle comes into play, people think it's really big and scary. But it's not. The peptide is actually less likely to give you any side effects than a curcumin supplement.
Okay. Yeah, I think you raise a good point there. As soon as something's intravenous, as soon as you have to, as soon as the method of delivery is injection, people automatically make the link, which is reasonable, to steroids, because obviously that's what people think about when they think about injections. But peptides aren't steroids, right? They're not steroids in any way.
No, peptides are amino acids. So the collagen that is marketed worldwide is a polypeptide. So collagen has more than 50 amino acids in its chain length, and it's considered to be a polypeptide. So the peptides that I like to use in mold illness and that are injected into you, they're not bad and scary because of the injection. It's just they're not orally available because the inherent nature of a peptide bond is very sensitive. So it would break down in the gastrointestinal tract.
Okay. So to go into the specific peptides, I think the most famous one has to be BPC 157. I think anybody that knows anything at all to do with peptides will have heard of BP 157. A lot of athletes will have heard of BPC 157. If you could give us a breakdown of, first of all, what BPC actually is.
Yeah, so it's a peptide. It stands for body protective compound, and it's 15 amino acids in chain length. And the main mechanisms of BPC 157 is that it activates vascular endothelial growth factor. Now, this in turn leads to a signaling cascade that ends up in angiogenesis, which is the scientific name for capillary formation. When you have a greater increase in capillary formation, you have more oxygen and more nutrients getting to the cell, you have more waste products being removed, and you almost remove pockets of hypoxia, so pockets of low oxygen area in the organs and in the tissues and in the cellular microenvironment. So it's a very, very interesting peptide. There's a whole bunch of benefits, like it also reduces oxidative stress. It's also very good at combating EMF. It also heals the gut microbiome, it heals the gut-brain axis, the vagus nerve. It also acts on the dopamine and serotonin neurons too. So it's a very widespread peptide. And actually in mold, you can run some very in-depth lab tests, and you actually see a lot of people with knocked out VEGF, which is a vascular endothelial growth factor. So you can almost use BPC 157 to increase that whole process again. So this is why I like to use it. At the same time, in mold, you can also get matrix metalloproteinase 9. So MMP9 can be very high. And this is a very cannibalizing proteinase that basically breaks down capillaries. So in mold, you have very low VEGF, very high MMP9, and this is why people in mold have very, very bad vascularity. So that was a little bit of a micro and macroscopic way to describe everything. But that's how I see BPC 157.
Obviously, as I mentioned before, a lot of athletes may have heard of this because of its use and efficacy in treating injuries, anything from broken bones, torn ligaments, especially. It's been found to be very useful. What's your view on athletes using BPC? Do you think it's an effective peptide to use, and what can they expect to gain from using peptides? And yeah, obviously there's things we could go into, such as should you go to the site of the injury itself to inject, or does it work more systemically, holistically? If you could give us an overview of considerations athletes should be making when it comes to BPC 157.
Yeah, so I don't work with many athletes myself. In the London clinic in Neutro, we do see a lot of athletes, but athletes need to be careful because a lot of these peptides are banned by the World Doping Agency. So they do need to be careful. But lucky for them, peptides only have a half-life of 4 to 6 hours. So like you can actually use peptides while you're training, even if you're being drug tested.
That's very good to know, actually.
As long as the drug test like isn't super random, you can, there's only like a maybe 4 to 5 hour window every day that the doping agency can knock on your door and say, oh, we need to test you. So the risk is relatively low. In terms of reward, I would say definitely athletes should be using BPC 157. It's a very interesting peptide. It basically reduces systemic inflammation as well. And if you need that extra time when you're training, you need to reduce recovery time, then BPC 157 is amazing. So for athletes, it's a big go. They've actually been using it in the athletic world for a number of years, and now it's only getting mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't heard anything about it 2-3 years ago, but now, like I said, I use it myself. I find it to be incredibly effective. I know lots of other people that use it, and like I said, there's a lot of talk about it now, and I think it's helping a lot of people. What potential side effects or risks should athletes or even just anybody using BPC be worried about, or even if they shouldn't be worried about it, what should people be cognizant of? What are the potential drawbacks?
I mean, in BPC 157, there's no clear signs of toxicity or negative side effects, and this hasn't really been reported. If you go on Reddit, you can find some anecdotal reports of maybe a few thousand individuals experiencing side effects. However, if you have millions of people worldwide taking anything, you will always have a small percentage of the population that has a side effect. Is this because of the BPC? We do not know, or is it because of some already infused inflammatory process in their body that seems to be exacerbated by BPC? So it's hard to say unless you look at a true clinical trial and study. In my patient population, I tend to see very low side effects. If someone is extremely kind of ill and sick with mold, and they're in a catabolic state, so the body is breaking down a lot of tissue, they have a lot of senescent cells, then BPC 157 can make them feel tired and a little bit aggressive. Okay, so that's kind of what I see. But, I think I can attribute that to the state of that individual prior to the BPC. And they also know this. They also know that I'm not in top shape. So it's less about, asking side effects. It's more about looking at an individual, deciding where they are on a scale. If you're super healthy, BPC is unlikely to give you these side effects. If maybe you are catabolic, then yes, you are more likely to develop sensitivities and side effects. But we know this.
Is there any evidence at all of people becoming resilient to BPC? So if they take it a lot over a long period of time, it starts losing its effects, or on the other side of things, dependency. If they take it for a long period of time, they find that they need to keep having it. Their body has come to rely on it.
I would say no. So BPC 157. So the general cycle is 3 months. So after 3 months, it is recommended that you take a break. Within 3 months, you can generally achieve all of your goals, and there's not diminishing returns. So the returns are compounding. Reliance, I would say no, because once you kind of have done 3 months of BPC, you've kind of initiated the angiogenesis signaling cascade. You've laid down those blood vessels. It's not like when you stop BPC, those blood vessels disappear. They've been laid down, they've been formed. You've almost, built them all up in your body. Obviously, if you were to stop BPC and kickstart a super inflammatory lifestyle, then you may see a reverse in all the gains that you've made. But that would be, your own responsibility. I don't think you can attribute that to BPC. So no, I don't think you can become reliant in a way, because the body, that's why they're considered to be regenerative, right? They regenerate and they improve your overall baseline level of health. So yeah, I don't think so.
If someone were to go beyond that 3-month cycle, 6 months, 12 months, whatever it may be, are there potential negative effects of that, or is it a case of simply you're just not going to see the gains that you were in those first 3 months?
So it's never been proven, but there is speculative theories that BPC 157, because of its angiogenesis impact, can lead to the formation of cancer. cancer metastasis, because cancer needs improved blood flow in order to survive and grow and so forth. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you look at the top peptide experts, they always just want you to do 3 months and then take a break. I think it would be silly to abuse that. It would be like a doctor giving you a pharmaceutical drug and you taking more than you're meant to, or taking like a month of antibiotics when you're meant to take 2 and things like that. So I don't think anyone should consider that. But possibly, I mean, I still don't think you'd get diminishing returns, but perhaps you'd stabilize and you wouldn't feel the same impact that you would within that 3-month cycle. I don't know anyone who's done this.
Moving on to a different group of peptides, growth hormone releasing peptides, growth hormone stimulating peptides. The big ones here tend to be ipamorelin, ceramorelin, and CJC. How do they work, first of all, and then what are the considerations people need to think about with growth hormone releasing and stimulating peptides?
So growth hormone releasing peptides stimulate the somatotroph in the anterior pituitary. And this basically starts the fire of releasing growth hormone and also a little bit of IGF-1 from the anterior pituitary. So it's not the same, and this is a big misconception, it's not the same as injecting exogenous growth hormone, which comes with a lot of risks, okay? All we're doing is stimulating the anterior pituitary to do its natural function, to just release growth hormone, increase the frequency of the pulsation of growth hormone. So it doesn't cause any negativity to that natural feedback loop. And this is what you do get when you inject exogenous growth hormone. So do not inject exogenous growth hormone. It's illegal. Actually, you have to buy it from like shady online websites. But the growth hormone releasing peptides, they're legal.
And what benefits can people expect to gain from having their own endogenous growth hormone stimulated?
Yeah, so basically, I will try to frame this in an interesting way. So an individual who is 100 years old has the same concentration of growth hormone in their anterior pituitary as an individual who is 25 years old. Okay? The only difference is the frequency of the pulse and the secretion. So this is actually what growth hormone is. It can be considered to be one of the master hormones. So without growth hormone, all of the cells in the body stop dividing. They don't reach their higher order. They become senescent, they become zombie cells. So that's actually why we age, because as we age, we have less secretion of growth hormone. So when you reintroduce the same pulsation and frequency in an older individual, you basically can reverse age, because all of the senescent cells can wake up and achieve their higher order and continue to divide and continue to repair and regenerate. So growth hormone is truly amazing. Again, I think people have a connotation between increased growth hormone and cancer, but this is not the case with the growth hormone releasing peptides. In mold, it's super interesting. The mycotoxin damages the cell in a very bad way so that the cell becomes senescent. So you can use a lot of growth hormone releasing peptides to wake that cell up out of senescence. And also the mitochondria in mold is heavily damaged. And actually steroidogenesis happens in the mitochondria, and the end result of steroidogenesis is growth hormone. So in mold, you have a double-edged sword. You have the senescent cells not creating growth hormone, so you have a lack of growth hormone release. And then also normally the person is very inflamed, so growth hormone isn't being released from the anterior pituitary. So the whole cycle becomes damaged. So when you introduce growth hormone releasing peptides to an individual with mold, it's like they're waking up all over again. They become anabolic, they have a lot of energy. My clients really enjoy the growth hormone releasing peptides.
So for someone that is already very vital, very alive, so to speak, their cells are already awake, someone such as an athlete, what benefits, if any, could they expect to see from using growth hormone releasing peptides?
So you will put on muscle mass accelerated. Your bone density will increase. You will have more energy. Your sex hormones can even increase. You can see a rise in testosterone as well. Just overall, you'll feel very strong. It's actually a very good combination with BPC 157 and also the TB 500, also known as TB4. So those three together, they work very, very well for athletes. Anyone who's looking to put on some strength, that's a really nice stack.
And as I mentioned, there's a whole plethora of these peptides that sound very similar: ipamorelin, ceramorelin, tesamorelin. Are the distinctions between these different ones, are they indeed distinctive? Can you expect to see different results from taking ipamorelin to taking ceramorelin, or do they all kind of basically do the same thing?
So they do the same thing. So you end up with relatively the same result, but the strength of the frequency and pulsation differs. So ipamorelin is what can be considered the weakest growth hormone releasing peptide. And then CJC1295 is stronger, and ceramorelin is also stronger too. Okay, so most of the time you can begin someone on ipamorelin and slowly work up. So you need to be careful. That's why you can, when you work with someone and you get to know them, you can like fit the peptide with who they are. Because you don't want to give everyone a super strong growth hormone releasing peptide. Sometimes you want to start off low and slow, especially for sensitive individuals.
What potential side effects or negative consequences could people potentially experience from using growth hormone releasing or stimulating peptides?
Headaches can be quite common because you are having that pulsation, so you're having an increased bioenergetic kind of environment within the anterior pituitary. So this can cause slight headaches. It normally disappears. It's normally on the first dose or the first try in older populations, but this normally disappears. And then again, you can get, some people feel a bit nauseous. Some people are a little bit sensitive. But overall, if taken under, very good supervision with the right support and someone guiding you and someone explaining all the mechanisms to you, I feel like teaching people about the mechanisms and having them integrate that science and that biology and those mechanisms significantly helps reducing side effects on like a kind of placebo manner. I think that works really well. But yeah, just like your typical headache and things like that. Very, very little. Very little. They're very low risk.
And if I'm correct, there's a distinction between some, they act on ghrelin receptors, and then some act on the pituitary directly. Is that correct? And if so, again, is there a real difference in results that you'll expect to see with that? And do you want to actually stack growth hormone peptides so you have one acting on the ghrelin receptors and one acting on the pituitary?
Yeah, so there's growth hormone releasing peptides and growth hormone releasing hormones. I personally prefer to use the growth hormone releasing peptides. They're the ones I'm most familiar with. The kind of blend that I'm most familiar with and the one I know the most about, the one I recommend the most, is CJC1295 blended with ipamorelin. So most of these growth hormone releasing peptides are used in weight loss. And I don't work with weight loss clients too often. So it's not my in-depth super area of expertise. But I know how they can work with senescence, and I know how they can work in the frame of mold and chronic inflammatory response syndrome.
And with the cycles, how long should people use these peptides before taking a break?
Yeah, so the growth hormone releasing peptides are 8 weeks. Yeah, so they're a lot shorter. You don't want to go above 8 weeks. This is when you see people using Ozempic. This is when they start to abuse it. You can tell, right? You see all the pictures online of its notable celebrities possibly being rumored to use Ozempic. And you can tell when they're abusing it, when they've gone over that 8 week mark.
And when someone's done an 8-week cycle on the peptides, how long would they want to wait before potentially doing another?
I would say 8 weeks. Yeah, definitely 8 weeks. Yeah, you want to give yourself a strong break with the growth hormone releasing peptides.
So 8 weeks on, 8 weeks off. It's kind of the cycle on, cycle off.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah, I mean it's flexible. It's a sliding scale. So even if you do BPC, you do it for 3 months. If you kind of complete those 3 months in 4 months or 4.5 months, because not everyone wants to jab themselves every day. People go on holiday as well. They can't take them out of the fridge and things like that. So it's flexible. It's meant to be enjoyable. It's meant to be fun. It's meant to be a new skill. It's not meant to be super rigid. So I like to, explain it to people as a sliding scale. And it's something that's meant to improve your quality of life, not make you feel even more trapped that you have to do this thing.
With BPC, say if someone did do 3 months, how long would they want to cycle off before they were to go back to it again?
I'd probably say 1 month to 6 weeks.
Moving on to a peptide that you actually mentioned a few minutes ago, the thymosin peptides.
Mm-hmm.
I think the two I'm familiar with in this category are thymosin beta 4 or TB500 and thymosin alpha 1. So if you could just take us through those, please, Jessica, as to what are the thymosin peptides, what's TB500, what's thymosin alpha 1, how do they work?
Yeah, so within the thymus gland, there's actually three different types of peptides: alpha, beta, and gamma. So thymosin alpha 1 is part of the alpha family. Thymosin beta 4/500 is part of the beta family, and then gamma, there's a few other peptides there as well. So these peptides are interesting because they basically mirror analogs of peptides that already exist within the thymus gland. So in 1977, there was a group of scientists who were basically spearheaded by a gentleman called Goldstein, and they were looking at the thymus of a calf. And they wanted to figure out if the thymus gland worked via hormone signaling or peptide signaling. And this is when they found a bunch of peptides, notably TA1, which is thymosin alpha 1, and TB4, TB500, which is thymosin beta 4 or thymosin beta 500. Yeah. So those are these peptides. Essentially, they tell the thymus gland to wake up and to basically enhance the immune system. So they're pleiotropic. So if the immune system is very overreactive, it will tell the immune system to calm down. If the immune system is underreactive, it tells the immune system to get a move on and stop fighting and put fire in its belly. So these peptides are very interesting. TB4 can be split up into its full fragment, or it can be divided into fragment 1 to 4, which is generally the best fragment for immune building. Or it can be split up into its other fragment, which is 17 to 23. And this kind of fragment is better for muscle growth and things like that. Or you can use the full fragment in people.
So are the thymosin peptides useful for people dealing with mold illness?
Yeah, 100%. It's the first peptide I use when I begin to work with someone. It stabilizes people very well, and it's actually patented. So TA1 is patented. It's actually, oh my God, the company is worth like a few hundred million, and it's part of the FDA organ drug program. And it's been used in many, many clinical trials of all ages at super high dosages. It's called Zadaxin. The patent is called Sudaxin. So it's a very interesting peptide, very low side effects. But there's no better peptide to use for someone with immunocompromisation, with a defect in the human leukocyte antigen gene than TA1. So it's a really, really nice stabilizing peptide. Then I like to go in with the TB4 frag 1 to 4 as well. You can get more side effects with the whole frag. And then you don't want to use the 17 to 23 frag in someone with immunocompromisation because that's generally acting on the actin and myosin muscle cells as well. So yeah, TA1 and TB414 frag are the perfect fit for mold illness and chronic inflammatory response syndrome.
What about for athletes? I mean, obviously, everyone, whether they're an athlete or not, is going to benefit from improved immunological function. But are there any more specific benefits for athletes to using them?
Yeah, so after our reproductive organs, one of the main organs that ages the most is the thymus. And actually, people think a lot of different hallmarks of aging are important, but I would say the immune system is an incredibly important hallmark of aging. And when you look at athletes, you want to keep them young and regenerative, and you want to keep them fit. And a big part of this is the immune system. So even though TA1 isn't the go-to peptide that maybe a coach working with athletes would use, they should begin to consider. But definitely TB4 and its 17 to 23 fragment, because this actually works on the actin and myosin, very specific muscle cells. And it's a very good combination, like I said, with BPC157 and the growth hormone releasing peptides. Yeah.
And again, in terms of cycles, how long would somebody want to take TB4 or TA1 and TA1, sorry, before taking a break, and how long would that break want to be before they then started taking again?
Yeah, so the general rule for peptides is 3 months. So the growth hormone releasing peptides and also LL37 have a shorter cycle in terms of just a few weeks. But outside of those two, it's generally 3 months. TA1 and TB4, they're not taken every day. So they have a much lower frequency. You can up ramp people. So you can do 2 weeks every day up ramped. You can work like this. After 3 months, you generally again want to take a 1 month break. That's kind of the golden rule. I actually prefer people to do a stack of maybe 3 to 4 peptides for 3 months. Take a break. Instead of going back to that stack, there's so many, there's like over 100, right? So instead of going back on maybe TA1 and TB4, you can look at MOTC and SS31, maybe cerebrolysin. Maybe you look at some of the other peptides that have different mechanisms. You strategically build and systematically build cycles throughout the year if you really, really want to, get going.
And now, I'm sorry, I didn't actually put this on the notes, so don't worry if you don't have any information on hand. But KPV, I hear a lot about KPV, and I'm not too familiar with that at all. Is there anything you can tell us about KPV, how that works?
Yeah, so KPV also a very interesting peptide for chronically ill individuals, especially in mold illness and SIRS. So in mold illness and SIRS, over 95% of individuals will have a lack of alpha MSH, so alpha melanostide stimulating hormone, which is a really important neuroregulatory peptide in the brain. And it basically controls a lot of the hormonal axis. It controls sleep, it controls pain, it controls mood swings, everything. So actually, when people are having a lot of hormone dysregulation, everyone looks below the neck, but we actually need to be looking above and thinking, does this person have a lack of alpha MSH? Anyway, so if you do a LabCorp and Quest test, if a person has mold, they are likely to have an alpha MSH that is below 10. It should be, the minimum is 35. Okay? So KPV, it's the active C-terminal peptide of alpha MSH. So we can actually introduce KPV into an individual with mold illness and chronic inflammatory response syndrome and mimic all of the amazing benefits of alpha MSH. It's not feasible to actually introduce alpha MSH into a person with chronic inflammatory response syndrome and mold. And people used to use melanotan 1 and 2. I don't use these. I did do a little bit of a write-up on them and then I retracted myself. I don't use them anymore. KPV is a lot safer. It doesn't come with any hyperpigmentation like melanotan 1 and 2, and it comes with a lot less side effects. So KPV is highly anti-inflammatory, highly antimicrobial. It's the perfect peptide for anyone who's immunocompromised.
Okay. So moving on now to really focus on mold illness, and I suppose I maybe should have asked you this at the start, but could you give us an overview? I think a lot of people won't be familiar at all with mold illness unless they or someone they know has or is suffering from it. So what is mold illness? How severe is it? Yeah, if you could take us through an overview of it, please.
Yeah, okay. So essentially, mold illness or chronic inflammatory response syndrome is an individual who has a defect in the human leukocyte antigen gene. They have come into contact with a mold infestation, normally in a water damaged building. This mold infestation has led them to inhale mycotoxins, which is a type of biotoxin. The mycotoxin has then caused an immune system response that is chronic because of this human leukocyte antigen gene defect. There is no cross communication between the innate and the adaptive immune system. So the mycotoxin is not correctly tagged, excreted, or detoxified in these individuals. And this causes chronic inflammation of the immune system. Now, how many people have a defect in their human leukocyte antigen gene? It's actually suggested to be around 22 to 25%. So 1 in 5 individuals. And we can test for this. It's pretty easy. It's not on 23andMe. So people ask me all the time, I have my 23andMe, can you have a look? And unfortunately, that was a blind spot by 23andMe, but it's not on a 23andMe. So you can get this test done for around $200 on Life Extension. They ship worldwide. You have to use a shop and ship process from the US, or there's a few labs as well, like LabCorp and Quest, but they're a bit more expensive.
So basically, an individual comes into contact with mold. This is usually basically a mold infestation in the house, presumably where they live. Because does it take a while to kick off, or could it be an isolated incident?
Okay, yeah. So it kind of depends. So people who have this human leukocyte antigen gene, they are factory installed at embryo with this defect. So it's not epigenetic, okay? So it's not turning on or off, okay? These are your alleles, this is how you were born. So you can actually be exposed to mycotoxins in utero if your mum is being exposed to mycotoxins, if your mother's being exposed to mycotoxins. More often than not, I see over the years people have been compounding and compounding their kind of toxin load. And it used to be when they were like 40, 45, they'd finally think like, what's wrong? And they'd start testing. But now I'm even seeing people who are 30, 28, even 25 get to the point where the toxin load and the mycotoxin load and the inflammatory response is just so overwhelming that they start to notice it. So most of the time people are unaware, like if you look at their overall macroscopic medical history, they can't put the pieces together. And then when they work with someone and we actually find out, oh, you have HLA defect, they're like, wow, I remember now I was in university and I started to feel a little bit sick. And then my second home in London also made me feel a little bit more sick. And now I feel sick, and they kind of put together all the pieces. So it can be, for some people, it can be one very large, very high mycotoxin load that is a huge exposure. Or for some people, it can be like slowly building up over the years.
Okay, so somebody that's 25 years old, they felt great all their life, they might not be aware at all that they have this defect, that they're susceptible to this, and then they might reach 50, and because of their environment and obviously because of their predisposition, then they could start feeling the effects. It isn't necessarily you come into contact with it and you immediately start to feel the detriments.
It can depend. I have one very close client. He was moderately okay for his whole life, and then he stayed in a very moldy house in Canada, extremely high mycotoxin load. And for him, this was like being shot. It's like a ton of bricks fell on him, and this was his eureka moment. Whereas I have some people who are a bit more agile, and for them, it's a slow compounding. And then we realize, and they don't have that eureka moment. So it can depend. It's individual basis. So some people can have one allele that is mold susceptible, and other people can have multiple. So it depends. Depends on the individual. It also depends if the individual is already into detoxing. So how healthy is the individual's life prior to finding out they have the HLA and things like that too. So there's a lot of nuances, but overall, if you have the HLA defect, there will be a point in your life where you start to think, what is going on?
And let's go into it now in terms of curing this illness, getting through it, getting over it. Somebody, through one way or another, finds out they've got mold illness. What do they need to be doing to get through it, get over it, in order to become a healthy person again?
Yeah, okay. So people think that the cure is in what I do. So people think that the hardest part in the cure is in the treatment. It's not. The hardest part in the cure is in the remediation and the removal from exposure. Yeah. Step number 1, get out of exposure or remediate your house. I can start treatment with you prior to this. Some people just really need to improve the quality of their life, and they want to start treatment before getting out of exposure and before their remediation. We can start certain aspects. One thing we can't tackle is the mark-ons, which is the multiple antibiotic resistant staph in the nose, because this causes further complications if you treat this in exposure. However, yeah, so people think the hardest part is finding a good practitioner and then working with them for a few months to clear everything, but it's not. The hardest part is actually finding out if you're in exposure with an environmental relative mold index ERMI test, which is the clinical standard, and then actually either moving house or apartments. But is that next house or apartment going to be worse? You don't know. You don't know, right? Or do you have to rip up all the walls in your house and spend thousands on remediation? Or is there mold in your pets? Is it your pets that's causing you to be constantly re-exposed? Have you moved house but you have a favorite blanket that's covered in mycotoxins? So actually there's so many more nuances with the remediation process. And the bar for remediation is low. Okay, so if you live in somewhere in Europe, like Portugal or Moldova, like good luck trying to find a good tester and a good remediation service. Whereas me, you can contact me, I can do telehealth and I can guide you wherever you are. But to actually have a brick and mortar business come and fix your home when you're in places that aren't mold literate, like that is the hardest part by far.
Yeah, I mean, I guess obviously in worst case scenarios, really bad cases, someone can look at the walls of their house, literally see the mold, and go, okay, yeah, clearly I'm living in a mold infected environment. But I'm guessing there are cases where it won't be visible to the naked eye, but that the house will indeed be full of mold and you'll be exposed to mold in a dangerous way. Is that right? And in that case, it's finding that test that you just referenced, finding a provider who can come into your house and do that test.
Yeah, so people think that, oh, I see mold, I can spot it, and I know what's going on. But that's actually more rare. More often than not, it's like a crawl space somewhere hidden in the attic or in the house that has a mold colony. Sometimes it's actually like underneath the house. So underneath the structural house where the builders were when they first ever built the house. Sometimes it's behind the wall in the actual structure of the house so that you can't see. So actually, yeah, you might want to think that, oh, I know if there's mold in my house, but you can go into the most beautiful, clean house, and actually you can have a very high EMI score, which is the test that I mentioned. So yeah, you always want to get tested. If you think you're sick, you want to get tested. And the worst actually is when there's mold in the office or someone's workplace or university or school, because then they have to go through the whole process of trying to get the employer or the university to change. And can you imagine? At least when it's in your house, you are moderately have the locus of control. When it's somewhere else, you don't have that control, right? So then do you move jobs? Do you stop going to school? Like who knows what you do? So this is really the hardest part.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like just such an incredibly difficult situation. Um, and as you said, 1 in 5 people have this gene or don't have this gene. So really, like the risk is higher than people think. So really, this is something really everyone should be conscious about their environments, whether they're exposing themselves to mold.
Yeah, so Dr. Shoemaker is the original mole dog, and he spearheaded, he basically got the snowball rolling in 1998. But still in the US, it's not widely accepted. And good luck in Europe and in Dubai in the Middle East. Like, good luck trying to get a traditional allopathic doctor to understand your symptoms.
The way, like this may be kind of outside your remit, but the way buildings are built now is very different than they were even say like 25 years ago. Different materials are used, they're erected much quicker. I'm by no means a builder, so I'm not an expert on this. But do you have any idea as to whether the way we're building buildings and houses now, is it better for mold or is it worse?
I think so. It depends on the country that the house is built and the building regulations. I think structurally speaking, we are better now, but Dr. Shoemaker says we've overloaded our houses with anti-mold paints. And then these paints have actually now bred super, super strong species of mold that are even producing worse mycotoxins. So we've almost like bred in werewolf versions now of mold because we've tried to use these anti-mold paints. I don't know about the studies on this, but Dr. Shoemaker, he's highly creditable and robust. So I'm sure if he is making statements like this, then he's seen it, widespread.
So it's a kind of a case of we've had this natural occurring problem. We've tried to create an artificial solution, which has then created an artificial problem on top of that.
Yeah, basically.
So, say someone's been able to remediate their house or moved away from the toxic environment, they're in a position to start treatment to look for the cure. What are the protocols? We've obviously talked about the peptides. What else will you use for a patient who's dealing with mold illness?
So peptides, really important. Binding is also really important. So you have to bind and remove your toxin load. Liver support, gallbladder support, supporting the bile acid flow. Also phospholipids as well. So mycotoxins nestle into the phospholipid bilayer of the cell. So you want to do a lot of phospholipid support. Some people have a lot of brain atrophy too. So you need to focus on the inflammation of the microglial cells. It kind of just depends. Some people, they have a very leaky gut. Some people have a lot of skin conditions. So it's very personal. You can also work on people's hormones as well. Some people have a lot of co-infections too. Some people as well, they are infertile too. So it's very specific. I would say the main therapies are anti-inflammatory supplements, binders, peptides, bile support. And then you can also go into parasite cleansing and things like that too, which I really like to go into. But you also have to work on the ears, nose, and throat too, which a lot of people forget. So there's a whole range of protocols and therapies, and every practitioner is slightly different as well. So it's a very close community. I'm very good friends with a lot of practitioners. I've trained under a lot of practitioners. And I also like to speak to a lot of my colleagues who are not in the mold illness and SIRS world too, and learn their protocols as well. For example, bioenergetics and metabolism. This could be very good for people with mold illness and SIRS.
You mentioned binding. I assume that's the process of consuming something to bind to the toxins in your body, which then flushes them out. Can you talk me through the practical process? What substances, what compounds will people use to go through binding? How exactly does it work?
Yeah, so there are a few different camps when it comes to binders. So Dr. Shoemaker only suggests the use of cholestyramine. So he has done clinical trials on over 10,000 individuals, and he has shown that the prescription drug that is usually used to reduce cholesterol is the perfect binder for the mycotoxin and is able to basically pull all mycotoxins out of an individual, and this reduces their inflammatory markers by a significant amount. You have other people that don't like cholestyramine. They say it's too harsh. They say that it actually leads to a worsening of symptoms. It takes too long, and that it also causes a lot of side effects that decreases the quality of life of the individual. So they prefer to use a lot of natural binders. In vitro, these natural binders do work. However, there's no long-term in vivo, so in human or animal studies to really show that these natural binders work. On an anecdotal level, if you look into the mold community, you look at certain pockets, you will see some people who have become completely well from using natural binders. And then you will see some people who have become sicker from using cholestyramine. Personally, I like to use cholestyramine alongside natural binders. I see working with people as a team project, so I will explain to the individual, here is the cholestyramine, this is why I like it, this is why I suggest it, but also here are the natural binders that you can use as well. And it's up to them to make the choice. So it's like a pilot, co-pilot effort. What I will say, I do know a lot of people who have just used cholestyramine and become 100% better, whereas some people need a bit more of a push and a bit more integrative approach.
Moving on now from mold illness, you've shared on social media a bit about your PTSD journey. If you could just talk to us a bit about that. I think something that a lot of people don't really acknowledge and realize is the fact that physical and mental health, they're intertwined. Like the body and brain, they work together. It's all a connected system. I think people tend to think of, oh, I've got an emotional health problem or a mental health problem, or I have a physical health problem, when really it's all integrated, right? Can you talk to me about that and about your journey and how you went through that?
Yeah, I'm really open about things. So in 2019, I lost my mother to suicide. So around a decade earlier, she had a brain aneurysm. So she actually had a bleed in the brain. So she had a structural problem in the brain as the years went by. And this evidently led to her acquiring a huge list of mental health issues. So she had, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, by the end, paranoia. She was on maybe 15 pharmaceutical drugs. And then, very sadly, in the end, she decided to take her own life. I love her so much. I respect her. I don't have any negative feelings left towards that kind of event because I understand, and my family, they also understand. So in a way, it is very sad, but it's almost been the catalyst to the positivity in my life. So having an event like that happen, and I was in the last year of university as well, so I had to push through and continue to get my biomedicine degree. But in a way, it's really been the catalyst in my life, and it's given me the springboard to grow from. It's giving me a lot of resilience, a lot of grit, a lot of courage, perseverance. I see the good in things all the time. I can forgive people easily and things like that. I can move on easily. I let go very easily. So I'm very happy. It's sort of cultivated a lot of the positive traits that I would attribute in myself. But it wasn't always like this. So I did have very bad post-traumatic stress disorder. And because I was the last person who saw my mum, so it was difficult, and I had very bad post-traumatic stress disorder, and I was caring for her the last year of her life. I would see her every day, and very stressful time period for me. So my brain chemistry changed in a way, and then I had to do a lot of psychotherapy. But I myself, I had suicidal ideations and also self-harm ideations and actions as well. That was in 2021, and then I got a lot better in 2020 when I started psychotherapy and accepting and learning. And now, I'm very glad that those are the cards that God dealt me.
Thank you for sharing that. I think
Yeah, it's
that's
my pleasure.
really inspiring to hear. Really inspiring to hear that, obviously a situation that can be so difficult and was obviously so painful for your mother and you and everyone around her can actually inspire positive change, can invoke positive change. And obviously, so much has come from that, the work that you're doing now, helping the people that you are. So, yeah, it's incredibly inspiring and beautiful.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, it's how it should be, you know.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's if you're able to cultivate that perspective and that way of living, I think that's the best way to live. It's obviously easier said than done, but yeah, I think that's the best way to live.
I mean, what can anyone do, right?
Yeah, exactly. What's the alternative?
What can you do?
As a finishing note, the modern world, everything is accelerating so quickly. We're exposed to so many different environments now that our biology just had no way of knowing it was going to encounter everything from the foods we eat to the toxins we're exposed to in our environment, such as mold. And from my perspective, I don't want to sound too cynical, but I do have a cynical view on this, that the modern world, in a way, is killing us. You're seeing so many people come about with so many different health problems, so many people becoming infertile. It can be quite a
Oh,
despondent picture. In a very general sense, in this world where we have so many, potential things to worry about from a health perspective, what should people be doing to ensure that they're thriving, that they're vital, that they're healthy in this day and age?
I mean, it's really hard. So almost 3 generations ago, a good diet and some exercise is all you'd need. But now we have epigenetic inheritation of bad genes. We're so toxic. The environment is so toxic. It's not enough to just eat healthy and go to the gym. So I feel like now it is really important that at least maybe one time a year you spend 3 months focused on detoxing. So detoxing parasites, heavy metals, mold, maybe you do a peptide protocol. Maybe you just have one consultation with one practitioner that you enjoy and that you want to work with, and they just give you a relatively reasonable plan that you carry out for 3 months to just reset you. Because if you look at the rate of Alzheimer's, of cancer, of infertility, of diabetes, of all of these chronic illnesses, people are getting them at a younger age more and more, and it's very scary. So it's not enough anymore to just have a good diet.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. And I think something you said there and something you said before when we are talking about peptides, I think that's kind of a really good point to summarize on, to enjoy this process if you can, which, if you're in a very bad place with something like mold illness or another chronic illness, can be very difficult. But like you said, if you can find a way so it doesn't feel so regimented, so it doesn't feel like a burden having to go for blood tests, having to work with a practitioner, having to go through different steps, if you can find a way to make it novel, to counteract it before it gets bad so it can be more enjoyable, then yeah, it's going to feel so much better, right? And you're going to gain so much more from it.
Yeah, I mean, if you are an individual and you're not sick and you have some investment that you can make, I mean, what is better than like waking up every day with like boundless vitality and energy and then working on a business and then loving your family? Like, what is better than this? You can't do this if you're sick. So if you book a one-time consultation with a good practitioner, it's going to cost anywhere between like $350 to maybe $600, and they can give you a plan, and you can work through that plan by yourself, and it's a high reward for the small price to pay.
Yeah, definitely. And just to clarify what I said there, obviously, like someone that's already dealing with an illness, it's not going to be fun for them. But that's why it's important
Yeah,
to,
yeah,
go with prevention first, so that you can, it more then becomes focusing on your vitality and health, which can be enjoyable rather than trying to cure an illness, which obviously does feel burdensome.
yeah. I mean, even if you are ill with mold illness and SIRS, it's kind of important to pick a practitioner who you could like relate to and have a bit of fun with. Like, you don't want to sit there with someone who's very serious and, doesn't give you any emotion and give you the hope that you need to carry on. Which is why I have a really nice patient and client community and just my community on social media as well. All of the mold illness and chronic inflammatory response practitioners are like boomers, like very old, very serious boomers. So I've managed to capture a really nice market share of young people who are interested in crypto, who are interested in regenerative medicine and things like that.
Jessica, thank you for everything you shared today.
Oh,
I found it
welcome.
incredibly valuable and inspiring as well. If people do want to reach out to you to work with you, or if people just want to view your content online to educate themselves, where can they go to do that?
So I guess we'll put it in the show notes, right?
Yeah, I'll of course put it in there as well.
So I post a lot on Instagram. I post a lot on Twitter as well. And then I would say those are my short form snippets of high level information. But if you want to see the whole story, you want to see my success stories, you want to see how mold illness actually works, then you can just go to my website, which is jessicaalana.com. And all my social media and everything is linked there as well. My email is jessica@jessicaalana.com too. So you can just email me and I have a contact box on my website as well, or DMs or, whatever people feel like doing.
That's great. Thank you, Jessica.
Welcome.